Okay, is that recording?
Perfect, thank you.
Cool. So when we are looking at what might be happening in maturing brains, we are bringing together two different frames, two quite different ways of approaching and knowing the mind. The one that adult development theory is embedded in is the constructive developmentalism. So kind of combining constructivism, which says that we create or construct our meaning through our experiences rather than using experience to figure out some pre-constructed meaning, and mixing that with developmentalism, which says that we cognitively mature and progress over the course of our lives. So bringing these two ideas together, saying that the systems that we use to make meaning in our lives changes and develops over time. So with this first frame, really looking at an emphasis on meaning making, and the systems of meaning making that change over a course of a lifetime. And comparing that with neuroscience, which has got a different frame, the study of nervous systems, which has got a biological basis of consciousness and perception and memory and learning. And there's within this, there's an implicit assumption that the basis is our biology and that consciousness emerges from matter. And so we end up with, whenever we bring two frames together, it's not neat space, it's messy space, because there's different assumptions, there's different imperatives, different agendas, different language. And so whenever there's this kind of marrying of two different fields, we've got to dance a little lightly and see what it is that we can make sense. But the reason obviously that we do this and bringing these frames together is because when we do bring two sets of techniques, two sets of ideas developed in separate contexts, we can see truth, we can know truth in different ways, and see if there's some bigger truth that emerges through the conversation between these two perspectives. So maybe let's start with the organ that we're talking about, and that is the brain. So each of us has one, fortunately, which is why we have managed to tune in and focus on what's going on. And were you to have a surgeon take off the top of your skull, like this picture, you would see underneath the bony plate that thick dura mater, the outer layer of the meninges, that dura mater, robust mother, really kind of adding protection to the brain that lies underneath. And then the more fragile pia mater, that tender mother that's overlying these hills and valleys, you know, forming the sulci and the gyri of the brain, which is Mother Nature's sleight of hand way of managing to fit a large amount of surface area into a fixed volume skull that'll still fit through a mother's pelvis. Because if that surface area was flattened out and our brain was really smooth, like it is in the case of a rat, for example, then we would have heads about the size of a small Pilates ball. And that would cause problems at the beginning of our lives. So it's really, really a feat of nature to maximize our brain matter, our surface area, by making these folds. And it makes for really interesting geography, of understanding the geography of our brain. So yeah, rat's brain, much more simple, quite a lot more straightforward, but much less capacity for things like reflecting on how our anatomy might shape our sense of self. So obviously our brains are made up of these brain cells, neurons. There aren't only brain cells, there aren't only neurons inside the brain, there are also supporting cells, an absolute host of them. But as you may remember from biology at high school or varsity, if you did it, each of these cells consists of a cell head, which is where the nucleus sits. And it's kind of grayish pink in color. It's where it's the motor room of it's the real engine room of the cell. It's where the thinking gets done, in a way, if I was to say it like that. And then this long thread, this axon, which is wrapped in fatty myelin sheath, which acts as a kind of insulation tape. Because this is conducting electricity, the insulation tape means that electricity can be conducted with less friction. And it means that this part of the cell is white. You can see the dendrites and the axons connecting with other cells. And that is how the layering together of the cell bodies forms the gray matter, this pinkish gray area around the crust, which is where the intelligent bit comes. And then these long tracts of white matter, these myelinated axons form the white matter inside the brain. So we've got the engine room happening on the outside, very cleverly increased surface area, and these connections between brains happening between. So we've got about 100 billion neurons inside our brain. We've got 1 trillion cells if you include the supporting cells. And I was trying to find, because it's quite hard to picture that kind of number. I struggle with that sort of number. So I was looking like, what does $100 billion look like? It's not very impressive. I mean, it looks like a big block. But then I was seeing one of the estimates of how many, there are 100 billion stars in the Milky Way. So that's the kind of number of neurons that you've got inside your own head. And each of these neurons is connected to, on average, 10 to 20,000 other neurons. So when you start taking numbers like 100 billion and times it by 10 to 20,000 potential connections, you end up with those like exponential numbers that lead to a statement like John Ratey's, that there are more possible ways to connect the brain's neurons than there are atoms in the universe. And so that's pretty cool, because basically inside each of our skulls is a galaxy of infinite potential that we got for free. And that's pretty awesome. So we're looking at the gray matter, we're looking at the white matter, we're looking under the microscope and seeing the neurons. We all know that the brain is divided into these 2 different hemispheres, that has been overplayed somewhat, oversimplified, and it's that kind of left brain, right brain mythology has been debunked significantly, but there still are regional specializations that happen. What's also helpful to know about the brain is that there is a vertical division and a vertical progression. So the lower parts of the brain that sit closer to the spine, kind of at the base of your neck, if you were to put your hand kind of here, the midbrain and brainstem, have got the least consciousness available to them. They're the seat of lowest levels of consciousness. So they are responsible for things like our heart rate, our breathing rate, our blood pressure, our temperature, the sorts of things that are being taken care of and still active in a person who's deeply unconscious in a coma in ICU, for example, but is still alive. So these are the parts of the brain that are responsible for this low-level consciousness. Moving up vertically, we reach the limbic system, operating with a little bit more consciousness, but still pretty unconscious. So this is the emotional space that drives our motivation, drives our choices around what we choose to prioritize, drives our strategies in quite an unconscious way. Moving up to the cortex, where we're looking at that gray matter and a lot more conscious control, so voluntary movement, that Mr. Hilltop in that song, Please Move Your Leg, is the cortical voluntary movement of the motor part of our body. And then right at the sort of most upper regions of the brain is this prefrontal region, which is where the seat of our sense of consciousness resides. And the more forward we come in towards the brain, the more conscious we are. So any questions or comments at this point? Cool. So if we were interested in the brain 5,000 years ago, it would have been thought that we were really odd, because the ancient Egyptians thought that the brain was just a cooling mechanism for the heart, that our thinking all came from the heart region. And so when bodies were being mummified, the brains were taken out through the nose, which is what's happening in this picture. And they weren't even put, like the kidneys were put into a bucket and mummified separately. The brains were chucked out because they weren't considered to be particularly useful. Over the course of observing what happens to people when their heads get damaged, there was a growing realization that the brain might actually be quite useful. And if we were interested in the brain 200 years ago, we may have bumped into something like phrenology, which was strange, now very debunked, pseudoscientific justification for sexism, misogyny, racism, and eugenics. But it was based on this idea that our brain was represented underneath the knobs and bumps on our skull. So if we had a knob in a certain part of our skull, then that was a large part of our brain underneath it. And that the brain regions represented 27 particular human capacities, like the capacity to be honest or dishonest, that sort of thing. Somebody is printing something on the printer. Sorry. So this has been debunked, but it did actually contribute something to the current study of neurology, because it was the first time that there was a thought that parts of the brain might be responsible for certain functions. And that led to the way that we were taught neuroscience when I was at med school. So 20 years ago, when I was a third year student, we were taught about the brain in a very kind of blocky, segmented, mechanical way, taking it bit by bit, learning what this was responsible for. So it went something along the lines of, this is Broca's area, it's responsible for articulating language. If it gets damaged, then the patient they can understand language, but they can't speak. This is how you investigate it, this is how you diagnose it, this is how you treat it, moving on to the next area. And we went bit by bit through the brain in that particular way. Fortunately, in the last 20 years, the understanding around the brain has become a lot more accurate, maybe, interesting, sophisticated, nuanced, and fluid. And so some of the things, I was just reflecting, what I'm seeing in coming out of thinking about the brain now is much more of a systems nature. So there's much more realization that the brain is not a bunch of Lego blocks. The brain operates much more as an orchestra than individual instruments, responsible for different functions. There's much more of an understanding of the embedded and embodied nature of the brain, that the brain is simply a localization of the neurology, but the neurology exists right the way through the body and is intimately connected with all the other mechanisms of the body functions, physiology, etc. And that this body is embedded inside a context. And actually what we're noticing in the brain is a neurological observable feature of a context. Because if we start to see in a stressful environment, this will be observable inside a brain as an enlarged amygdala. Or if an environment is enriched with very nourishing relationships, we can see that showing up in the insular cortex, for example. And so we've got a much more fluid understanding that the brain is an embedded part of the context. And that's a much more useful way of understanding what the brain is doing and how to influence the brain. Also, there's a much greater understanding of the plastic and emergent nature of the brain. So there was 20 years ago, it was almost taboo to think that the adult brain changed significantly apart from aging. You kind of were stuck with your lot, and that was it. Whereas the plastic and emergent nature of the brain, the changes through adulthood and the intentional changes of adulthood, and this bilateral relationship between brain and mind is so much more empowering, because we can use, as Rick Hansen says, we can use our mind to change our brain, to change our mind for the better. And this is self-directed neuroplasticity, which is what we are all up to and interested in, and possibly why we are here. So, those of you who are fans of Daniel Siegel will probably have heard him express his dismay and disbelief that we still do not have an agreed upon definition of mind. And how a number of years ago he gathered, I think it was about 50 academics and real thought leaders from different fields, psychology, psychiatry, mathematics, to generate a working definition of mind. And what they came up with was mind is the emergent, self-organizing, embodied, and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. So if it means then that the brain is host to energy and information flow patterns, swirls of energy and information that have got symbolic meaning value. Now that's a very different concept of what we're dealing with, rather than a little Lego guy. Yeah, and I love that thing around the mind is what the brain does. So this kind of sense of the noun verb of the mind brain. But just anything you wanting to comment on, Julia?
No, I just want to say how grateful I am that you're using language I can understand. So thank you. Sorry to do that in the middle of the talk, but thank you.
Cool. So what is maturity then from a brain perspective? So if you were to, or if you go digging around what there is, what literature is out there around maturity from a brain perspective, the vast bulk of the research that's around is around the maturing of the adolescent brain into the adult brain. And it's really important and it's really interesting, and it brings up some, useful thoughts around policy. At what point is the adolescent brain mature enough to take full culpability for misdeeds, and how should that influence, minor offenders and sentencing? At what point is the brain mature enough to take responsibility for sexual and reproductive health? So there's some basics around the maturing adolescent brain that feed into our understanding of what might be happening once adulthood is reached. They're principles that can continue. The first is that brain regions and systems mature along different time frames. So there's no single point where the adolescent brain becomes the adult brain. Pretty much logical reasoning kicks in around 16, but the maturing of the prefrontal lobes to their completion is the mid-20s. That's kind of the point at which you are considered old enough and mature enough to drive and drink and get a loan and inherit your mother's fortune and that sort of thing. So when we start looking beyond mid-20s and into the adult kind of realm of maturity, we don't see a coherent body of literature. We see pieces. We see studies that either interest researchers because it's part of their paradigm around particular perspectives or states or traits or changes in behavior. And so if we hold the maturity framework, we then can start quilting together some studies into something that starts to make sense from maturity. But we're quilting. This is not a neat space, as I was saying before. Again, I just want to stop and see if there's anything that anybody wants to ask, comment on. Cool, otherwise I'll keep going. So there are some principles around maturation, both from conception through to adulthood and then adulthood onwards. And it's really, what are we doing when we're talking about development and maturation? We're talking about playing with our gray matter on the one hand. So those cell bodies that form that crust around the brain, we can thicken and upregulate areas that serve us, and then we can thin and downregulate areas that are not serving us. And so it's visible and it's measurable, the thickening and thinning of certain areas. And so the violinist, cortical representation, both sensory and motor, of fingertips is much, much thicker than mine would be, because I'm not engaged in an activity that's building the gray matter around my fingertips. What is it that builds gray matter? Is effort and attention. So this handsome man reminds us that what we build thickens and what we don't build thins. It becomes atrophied. What we use. And so where attention goes, energy flows and neurology grows. So that's that kind of thickening through paying attention to something. So this is this one idea of playing with the thickening of the gray matter, but then we can also play with white matter. So coming back to those tracts, those myelinated axons that are forming little bundles or bigger bundles or thicker bundles and are more or less useful in transmitting the energy and flow of information between regions. We can start to develop connections between regions that weren't previously connected, or thickening connections that were existing. This is really cool because it means that there can become a connection between parts of ourselves that were maybe happening in parallel, but not necessarily feeding into something coherent. So studies that give visuals on the connections between regions look like this, and that changes significantly through life. But what I really love is the idea of being able to plug ourselves into parts of our life and parts of ourselves, and letting regions start to talk to each other, which surely is what we're doing in therapy or in coaching. We're allowing certain regions of ourselves to talk to each other. And so why are we wanting to thicken our gray matter and increase the extent of our white matter connection, is because we know that when an area, any system, whether it's a brain or whether it's a team or an organization or a country's government, is differentiated, it's specialized, it's thickened in a certain area and linked, that the differentiation is linked, regions are linked to each other, the system is integrated, and that allows it, as Dan Siegel says, to be much more flexible, adaptable, coherent, energized, and stable. And to my mind, that's what growing maturity is about. Yeah, Julia, I don't know if you would agree with that. So an example that we can look at is that of emotional literacy. So something like the wheel of emotions. So as somebody's limbic system, which sits very much underneath the level of awareness, starts to move up into becoming more connected with conscious areas of the brain, there is an increased capacity to recognize emotions in a conscious way. So this is connecting parts of the prefrontal region with the limbic system. We start to increase the white matter tracts between these regions. If we then can connect that with the region responsible for language and increase the vocabulary available to us to describe what it is that we're experiencing, so that we're upregulating that language center and connecting it into our experience, then we have the capacity to be quite articulate about what we're experiencing in our emotional landscape. So just as an example of how we can connect in different regions of the brain to produce a different experience of ourselves and our lived experience. So attention is like a spotlight, illuminating what it rests upon, and neuroplasticity is heightened for whatever is in the field of focused awareness. So directing attention skillfully, which is what is it that we're choosing to really pay attention to, is fundamental way of shaping our brains and our lives over time. Cool. So it's a lot of talking from me, and I'm going to be quieter just now. But again, I just want to stop and check if there are any questions. Or comments.
Nicola?
Yeah.
Can you say something more about attention, what that actually means? What is it? What does it look like?
So attention is used as a distinct word from awareness, which is kind of a floodlight of knowing, which is undifferentiated. And attention is a gathering in of awareness into a focused beam. So it comes from the word attendare, which means to stretch. And it's a kind of a stretching up and out of awareness and landing on an object. So whether that object is an object of choice or an object that is just part of our conditioning. It's that knowing of that object in a focused way. So much of our life, I think, we experience what we call continuous partial attention. It's kind of a sort of aware that, like, I'm drinking my cup of tea and I'm sort of aware that I'm drinking my cup of tea, but I might get to the end and not really know that it's there. Or there's a much more focused, conscious engagement with that experience, which is a deeper, more granular, more vivid knowing. And if that, yeah, cool. So, yeah, Julia.
Nicola, I've got a question from those of us with the ADHD. This must mean that because our attention is often quite fleeting, unless we have moments of hyperfocus, which I'm grateful for. Does this mean our capacity to thicken and integrate is a little bit more limited? I know it's a tricky question.
Yeah, I don't know, Julia. I'm thinking back on research that was talking about multiple limited periods of time of meditation as opposed to large chunks of meditation, and how there wasn't that much difference of rapidly sequencing small batches of focused attention compared with a 40-minute sit. So I would infer from that maybe it's not just the constant dose, but it's the coming back to again and again and again and again.
Okay, nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I suppose, Simon, I just, you always used to tell that story about the Brazilian children who could play soccer. Remember that story about brains?
Very vaguely, Julia, but I'd have to go and look it up. It was about 10 years ago. But thank you for putting me on the spot in that way. You know how I love that.
The spotlight.
Yeah, we used to teach neuroplasticity something or other 10 years ago, Simon and I. He had this lovely example of how his little girls came back from Brazil with exceptional soccer skills. Because in Brazil, attention was paid to getting children to pay attention to soccer. Whereas here, they're not necessarily doing the same thing.
Yeah. And so that attention building that motor and sensory capacity and all that goes on underneath the scenes, which is often invisible. So there are three particular findings that I thought were relevant for maturity to explore. And the first is around, there's been a lot of, in the last 20 years or so, research into where is the sense of self located, and particularly where is a sense of conscious self located in the brain. So there have been quite a few fMRI studies aimed at trying to figure out which are the regions of the brain responsible for a conscious sense of me. And what has emerged quite clearly is what's called the cortical midline structures. So if your two hemispheres were like this, if you were to make your hands, the different hemispheres, and then the regions of your fingers that touch each other. So the innermost part, the sort of midline part of your cortex, those regions are responsible for different aspects of a sense of self. So some of them have got high levels of consciousness available to them, and some of them have got lower levels of consciousness available to them. So we have this cohesive sense of being a whole individual, but actually there are these distinct neurological processes that are contributing to what makes up this whole sense of me. And there are parts of this, these cortical midline structures that are responsible for a narrative sense of me. So being able to retrieve memories from the past, autobiographical memories, be able to project myself into the future, this kind of time traveling sense of me that is experienced significantly in that green part, that posterior cingulate part of the brain, contributes significantly to that version of me, the story of me. there's another part of me which is an embodied sense of me. It's a felt sense of me, even if I'm not referencing the past and the future. I still feel like I'm here, and I still feel like a full person. And then there is that interesting thing is, if I take away my body, and researchers can manipulate that, they can play around with a part of the brain called the temporoparietal junction, which is responsible for that sense of messages coming in from me or not. There's still a sense of I'm here and I'm awake. And so it's called the minimal self. It's kind of like pure subjectivity in a way. So I mean, there's a whole thing around the neurology, the neurological basis of self. You know, self is a noun, self is a verb, self is fixed and fluid. You know, does it even exist? We certainly have an experience of self existing. And what I've found really interesting is what happens when part of our self that is of a higher capacity, higher up in the vertical anatomy, that has high access to higher conscious capacity, connects with the deeper part. So that blue part, that anterior cingulate, is responsible for deep motivation, and this is formed and shaped by emotional experiences in the past. It's responsible for weighing up risk and benefit and choosing which direction to go. And this is happening underneath the level of consciousness. I kind of have white labeled it for myself as the Enneagram. What we learn about as the Enneagram is happening in that blue region of the brain. And then the story of me is happening in the green region. And if we connect that with the yellow and the red, we can do what Keegan talks about, is we can start to make the lenses that we look through, we can look at them. So I just want to move this slide on. There's somebody going through an MRI, but we look out at the world and take it for what it is until we have those moments where we start to notice the lens through which we have been looking. And so one of the questions that I was wondering about is, how does this capacity to connect the lower drivers that influence a sense of me with an awareness of me, how does that change how I experience myself? How does that change my sense of self? So I was wondering if we could break into groups and just have a look at some questions. And so what I was thinking is, if you could consider a time when a lens that you had previously been blind to, looking through it as subject, came into focus as object. What catalyzed or allowed you to see that lens? And how did this change your sense of self?
Good.
So, cool. So just that inner experience, the subjective experience of connections between different parts of your cortical midline structures.
That was one of the conversations. No, it's not your fault. There's never enough time, but such a complex, interesting question. You know, there's a whole workshop just in that one brief you gave us. Really interesting.
What came out of your conversation, Simon?
Oh, shit, loads. So we sort of were sharing instances from our lives where we've experienced this sort of stretching and pushing and deepening of lenses, and kind of came to the conclusion that they were all quite stemming from quite horrific and traumatic experiences.
Sure.
It's never coasting along, having a wizard jolly time where you stumble upon another piece of yourself or experience a kind of an opening of a worldview. Generally, it's through shitty stuff, or what might be seen as shitty stuff. You know,
yeah,
tough stuff.
And Simon, that changed capacity of that subject object and the sense of self. What relationship were emerged in your conversation?
What relationship? What to?
Yeah. To just a sense of who I am, a sense of me.
Yeah, I mean, my own example was around my levels of reactivity and going through divorce, and an increasing awareness of second person and third person, like what must it be like to be in this conversation with me, as my 368 is out on the open road raging and being quite reactive sometimes. So it was that really. And then the other point was, and then what do I do with that? Because I can like beat myself up and go, God, you're being a reactive tosser again, or work with that a bit differently.
Yeah, there's such a tenderness to the seeing, such a crucial thing around how do we attend when we see what we see.
Yeah, if you've got any propensity for inner critic, then it's a great opening.
And there's, I don't know, but it feels like for me there's a moment where we can slip down a channel of story of self with that kind of narrative part of our sense of self circuitry, or the felt sense of self, the feeling of me, and that kind of has a little bit less commentary about it. Sure. Yeah. So interesting, Simon. Sounds like touching the nerves.
Yeah, I think we all felt a bit of that.
Thank you for offering it. Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts or reflections that came out in your conversations in the smaller group? Yeah, Meg.
Yeah, we also had some interesting conversation. And we didn't explicitly mention it, but I agree with Simon around the events that trigger a thing like this are often horrible. And so, I mean, we spoke a bit about the Enneagram and how that helps to move from subject to object. And we spoke about racism being a lens that is, horrific to realize. And so we said that it felt so that very simply, it's when something that we've known to be a truth, we suddenly realize is an assumption and not true. And then it feels really destabilizing, like the rug has been pulled out from underneath you, and it's like, whoa, what do I trust? What do I, and then a new sense of self has to be found, because it feels very unstable at that moment of moving.
Yeah, and I wonder from a brain perspective, what happens, what's the neurological correlate of that sense of destabilization and then the rewiring that happens around it, that either becomes quite rigid or quite chaotic or more flexible and adaptive. What might be happening in those white matter substrates that is being experienced in that way of, I don't actually know how to process, make meaning of this data that's now coming at me, and how to orientate myself.
So do I grab onto a new truth?
Yeah.
Maybe it's,
or remain more open to a variety of possible truth.
Yeah, Julia.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, remember I was talking to you about my son, and there's that term that I can't remember what is that thing?
Sclerotic therapy.
Yeah. So maybe it's a form of sclerotic therapy, that actually what happens is like that little tendril gets cauterized. And then the thing has to go off and try and wedge a new path, like an amoeba out of the side, using only some.
Yeah. It's a really
Because that's
interesting thing.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I
Julie.
mean, that was my sense of this shock and horror that is almost a physical pain, like shit, that nerve is now cauterized.
Mm.
It is no longer an opportunity for sense making.
And so white matter pruning is something that happens a lot in adolescence. You know, there's a
Right.
plethora of connections that aren't used, and so there's a cutting back. And so I don't know if this is the case, but it's interesting just from a felt sense of what's happening is something's being cut here, and there's a moving away from a previous frame that was helping us to interpret things, and needing some other connection to be able to hold what we're now seeing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And this whole idea in existential thought that you have to actually make meaning. It doesn't come naturally. Like you have to build those neural pathways, and it can require some effort sometimes.
Yeah. And if we don't apply some effort, not with a grim face and kind of, you know, not that kind of an effort, but if we don't apply some effort, then it's purely reactive wiring, and we're simply left at the with a frame that's entirely conditioned. And it's the application of attention that allows that to be shaped. And we can do it without a scrunched up face.
Nicola, just to link this back to your previous comment and also a conversation that happened in our group, the aspect of, or the importance of movement as well as attention came up in our group. So somebody had this subject-object shift, you know, during a movement, a run. And then we got talking about somatic wisdom and you know, all those methodologies with even ontological coaching that says, well, the real change is cross-training across the physiology, the language that you're holding, and the emotional attachment you have. So if you're cross-training across those three attentively and involving movement, then you're probably giving yourself a best chance for shift. So and then it also reminded me of your brain and the different aspects of self and where they're located. And we had some other theories in our group. So that would be nice to, I don't know if you have any insight on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it's going to hit directly where you're going, Roland, but there's certainly a lot of evidence that says that and I can't remember what color it was on that picture of the brain, that posterior cingulate, the kind of that piece of one of those cortical structures that's at the back side. I think it was green or blue, one of them. But that kind of sits in it. It's a central node of our default narrative. So it's just this kind of ongoing narrative of me, the story of I like this, I don't like this, it suits me, how could they do that to me, what am I going to do next, what are all the things that kind of, when that is operating, very little new can emerge. And so often people experience when they're doing something totally different that a new thought or a new perspective can pop up. So there might be something in that physical activity, that running, that dampens down that posterior cingulate and allows some new perspective to emerge. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's directly speaking to what you're asking, but that's kind of would be my entry point.
Yeah, it's nice to have the sort of neurological take on that. Makes sense. And I'm sure Kate will have a comment on that particular.
Yeah, so that was the example that I had raised, and so I'm just wanting to clarify: is that the default mode network, Nicola? That's what you're talking to.
Yeah. It's a central node of the default mode network. Yeah. Exactly.
So if I'm running, my default mode network is dumbed down so that I can make different connections that I couldn't normally when the default mode network is active.
If you're engaged in the running, if you're just mulling over what somebody said to you yesterday, then it's highly active. But if you're really engaged in your running, then it's dumbed down.
And hence the power of psilocybin, because it dumbs down the default mode network. So the the brain can connect in different ways.
Yeah.
Okay, super helpful.
And so a lot of the capacities for generating insight is really around how do we turn down the volume of this default mode network that's just like a radio announcer on the inside of our ear, non-stop, and it's really boring sometimes, and quite damaging quite often.
Which is the inner critic too, right?
Exactly.
It's the same.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's that narrative sense of self. And it's really interesting to me, I think, because that posterior cingulate is really good at retrieving emotionally charged autobiographical memories and helping us to figure out how we're wanting to move forward. What are we wanting to do next? Which is just reliving our past over and over and over again. And so much of what we're doing is helping people to recognize an event as an event and make new choice. Not only guided by this emotionally charged memory that's sitting in this part of the brain. So it makes me, I love the question of, as a self, when we start reflecting on ourself, then who are we, and it makes me think of that limerick, that there was a young man who said, though it seems that I know, what I would like to see is the I who knows me when I know that I know that I know. And so as we kind of reflect on the subjectivity and the objectivity of those midline cortical structures, we can kind of hold that elusive question of who is it who's asking this question. And if you're okay to move into one of the other brain changes that I think might be useful and pair up with the maturity framework. So if I am able to share my screen again. Is that showing?
Yeah.
Oh, it's fine. Oh, and hang on. Okay, there we go. I found this just before, which I thought was so cool, because actually the activity you just did is strengthening your cortical midline structures. So that self-reflection of yourself when you had an experience of coming into contact with a lens that became from subject to object is itself doing the work. So that's pretty cool. And I really like this. I think, it's Ram Dass saying, through all the years of practice from psychotherapy and psychedelics, meditation and yoga, I've never gotten rid of a single neurosis. They're all still there, but they've gone from being huge, scary monsters to delightful little shrews. I see one coming along and I say, oh, there you are again. I remember you. Tricky little thing, aren't you? And so that's quite inspiring to me. So let us move on to another element, which is around the insular cortex, which many of you will know about. And the insular cortex in this picture is shown in green and separated out. And if you look at my brain here, you have to kind of take off the lid like that, and you can see another sleight of hand of Mother Nature folding in another extra little bit of gray matter to our advantage, right folded inside, right inside the parenchyma. And this insular cortex is an amazing piece of the brain, and it's dished up some real surprises over the years and is being studied more and more. It's got many functions, and it's one has to simplify it just to make this tolerable. But one of the things that the insular cortex is responsible for is this incredible capacity that we have as humans to intuit what another person is experiencing, to have a grasp of a mental state of another. So if we see somebody biting into a sandwich and wincing, it doesn't take a lot to realize that they are experiencing something disgusting, to the point that it might even make our own stomachs churn and we might put our own sandwich down. So we're likely to cry if we see a loved one having an ultrasound or going through suffering. We might get really angry if we see somebody else being hurt. And so So this capacity in the insular cortex, like any region that is represented by gray matter, can be upregulated and downregulated. And I think in the distant history and recent history, there are a lot of examples of the danger of this part of the brain being downregulated, because there's something in here that is either mapping a sense of we and the sense of care to a small group of people or a larger group of people. And we can think about any form of genocide, the Rwandan genocide, what was happening in apartheid, what was happening with the Nazis, and you know what's happening at the moment around the world is when there's a limitation around we and them, then our sense of care or compassion or empathy becomes restricted with the consequences that we are fully aware of. So there are a number of things that the insular cortex is really interesting because it is also responsible for interoception, which is the felt sense of the body from the inside out. And what was really interesting was studies around people who were doing things like the body scan, who were doing practices that were very focusing attention on the felt sense of the body from the inside out, ended up with the insular cortex growing, and as a totally unexpected byproduct, a sense of compassion developing alongside that. So it's a fascinating part of the brain that we can develop both by intentionally increasing our field of compassion, or by paying attention to our own bodies, surprisingly. So this Tibetan monk who's being wired up here for an EEG is sitting alongside a digital representation of an insular cortex that's lighting up because there'd been increased thickness. The pictures come from two different studies, but they speak to the same finding, that the more attention is given to upregulating compassion and body awareness, the more we are able to see that represented in neurological thickness. I mean, insular cortex thickness. So I was just wondering in the conversation in the bigger group, how that field of we might expand along the maturity framework, just as you think about it.
And I always have something to say, but I think
Thanks, Julia. Yeah.
You can tell me to shut up. You know what is interesting that I've just clicked on here is that in the maturity model, we sort of go through patches of becoming very we orientated and very I orientated. And I suppose when we I orientated, our kind of current level of we orientation gets stabilized. And then we have that sort of time off back into our I orientation. I mean, I do think that you do see in the maturity model a greater awareness of we, and paradoxically, a greater awareness of I, and it doesn't look how you think it would look. So like the sort of we helping thing that you might see at earlier stages might be very different at late stages. It might be more not helping because it serves other people to not help. And I think there's definitely something in what you're saying, and one's capacity to think through we as a separate thing from us that might have separate rules or separate desires for how they behave in the world. I just don't know how that would work neurologically, but I love the idea of the we, thickening of the we, because now maybe we know what to do with the sociopaths.
Yeah, I mean that's Melanie Klein that who talks
Yeah.
about, you know, if this isn't developed, then that you end up with this primitive paranoid schizoid states, you know, where it's all me and I, you know, it's only the I and the other is there purely to serve my voracious appetites. And I mean, it's an interesting thought, Julia, around also what does compassion look like through the levels of maturity?
Yeah, and I think
How-
it's changes.
Mm. So,
You know what might also be another factor is the experience of time, and how people assess compassion. Like, if you have a car accident with a dog, do you kill the dog because you know it'll never walk properly, or do you try and bring the dog back to health and know it doesn't have a home to go to after that? I don't know. I'm not sure, but I do love playing with these ideas.
Nicola?
Yeah.
I have a half-baked theory. And I'm fascinated by Interreception and the body scan, and I use the body scan as like the undercoat for all my coaching work. And I would imagine it's, to go back to Siegel's integration and differentiation, that language, the formation of language is a form of differentiation. And I guess we can argue that social media and artificial intelligence is even a further abstraction of that. We're getting more and more differentiated without getting integrated again. And so I like this idea of coming back to the felt sense. Once you've abstracted yourself, differentiated yourself, is then to come back to the core, which could be represented in your brain as well, as you've set it out today. That actually a return to the body allows you to integrate the abstraction or the differentiation with your felt sense. And actually the wisdom of morality or the we is actually sitting in the felt sense, not in the differentiation through the language. That's my half-baked theory.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah, but that means the body scan is the secret to world peace, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, well, I laugh, but it's really, I mean, it's fascinating how, and especially when something unexpected pops up like that, you know, then that gets your attention. And just, I mean, I find it interesting in terms of parenting as well. You know, what is it that's being cultivated in body, felt sense of moving back? I think, you know, Julia, that kind of movement from we to I, that movement, that kind of waves, we could probably also go through those waves of differentiation and then kind of linking, and then differentiation and linking again. I don't know. But I love what you're saying. Yeah.
Say that parenting must, for me, be the most regular lens challenge, minute by minute sometimes, and parenting two very different little people, big people, different personalities. When I'm confronted with a different personality and what it pulls in me, it brings me back to what my lens is, and it's astounding, it's exhausting, and it's massively rewarding.
Yeah.
So there is like a dopamine thing when you get some sort of insight. Is that what you're saying, Sarah?
Yeah, well, there's a lens shift often. Our parent, our firstborn is a Enneagram 6, and our secondborn is an Enneagram 8, and noticing where I am with me, if I walk into a room and interact with each of them, what gets pulled in me confronts me with, you know, what I was the moment before I walked into the room. You know, so I'm happy, I'm doing my thing, and I walk in, and, you know, for argument's sake, my Enneagram 8 might go, why did you walk in the door? And I'm suddenly confronted with, oh, so, you know, you know, and thinking how in the wee of that moment, he finds it affronting that I walked in without her knowing I was going to, or that I didn't knock, or that whatever. But I was walking in with a very different view of how was your day, or can I get you some, you know. So that parenting thing of what is me, what is them, what is us, what are we co-creating, you know, how do I as the adult facilitate, you know, those moments? It's hectic.
Yeah, it's such a visceral experience of confronting.
Can I raise something completely different?
Yeah.
I've worked most of my life as a journalist, and one of the things you might not think it, but one of the things that makes a good journalist is this ability to intuit and to hear others' stories and identify with them, even if they're completely opposing to your own. And what I've seen is as in terms of maturity is that quite often, especially when in starting in journalism in the sort of 90s, where people were, you know, there's sort of the bang bang club and quite a lot of machismo around going out and into the most violent and trying to cover and show other people's stories that weren't being told was on the one hand a hardening and a lessening of that sense of empathy and intuiting how other people were, because they simply had to build these kind of walls, and yet at the same time a kind of a breakdown where they couldn't process it properly. I don't quite know what that means, but it was something that as you started talking about intuiting, it's a very much a sort of thing that a journalist prides themselves on being good at this, and yet over time it seems to harden, but come in combination. So in a sense, get less, feel less, worry less about the stuff that you ask and the people that you confront. I suppose maybe the thing is that what I'm getting to is that maybe more journalists need to spend more time in therapy so they can process it, you know, because that is definitely what I see is this hardening of that intuition, but or certainly of a sense of identifying with others, at the same time as some kind of breakdown.
It makes me think, Adam, as you're speaking of a trauma surgeon, which I think is in a similar position of in a compassionate act is actually becoming quite defended as pure survival tactic. And also in the processes, there's a kind of a breaking down as well. Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. And I mean, it kind of leads me into the next piece, which is, you know, if we are in some ways being able to objectify our subjectivity, and in other ways being able to subjectify people who may have been objects in some way, how does that change the way we call to mind what's important? Is that video showing again? I mean, the screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I just put them there because they're both such mature and compassionate and have thick insular cortices. But there's a third piece of machinery. I hate that word, but there's a third piece of network that I wanted to touch on today in the session, which is our salience network. And it's an intermediary between our idle state, which is when our default mode network is operating, which is what Kate was talking about, and our central executive network, which is the part of us that's our get up and go. But we don't have to get up and go. It's just is our attend. This is important. We may need to do something here, circuitry, which you can see is lighting up different parts of the brain. So they are anti-correlated with each other. When the central executive network is operating, the default network is not, and vice versa. And it's mediated by our salience network, which is governed by, to large part, our anterior cingulate circuit, which we spoke about in what's me, and therefore what's relevant to me, and our insular cortex, what's we, and what is relevant to us. And so as we expand our sense of self and we expand our sense of we, our salience network broadens. And so a field where we may have been triggered to attention by only one or two pieces of data that feel relevant, we now have access to be called to attention by a much greater spectrum. So I'm wondering whether we should break into small groups or just have a conversation in the bigger group around these questions. Like, what enters your field? Maybe we just do it together as a collective. What enters your field is relevant and is foregrounded now that would have been filtered out or backgrounded when you were in your early 20s? What does this expanded field of salience offer you and others? And if we get there, what strategies or practices could further expand your salience network? So if we just started with that first one, what gets foregrounded for you now that was before just kind of part of the periphery?
I know for me it's time, like a sense of the smallness and arbitrariness of this particular time. Whereas in my 20s, I would think this was all my life. This particular incident was all my life. Now I think it's just a small part of my life.
So kind of.
So, so in the event, the context of my life is foregrounded, and the event seeps into the foreground because the context of my life is now so much longer. There's so many examples of how events happen and pass. And I seem to survive them all.
Julia, am I right in saying that the sense of the context of your life is foregrounded?
Yeah, it's flipped. Okay. It's flipped. So the event has been pushed into the background. It's so contextual.
Yeah. It's a very cool example.
I'm playing with the idea of existential neuroscience.
Yeah, lovely.
You know, because the thing that springs up for me is death. And the finitude of life, and you know, being and not being, and all of that stuff, and how in my 20s that was, and probably my 30s, it really wasn't much on the radar. Arguably in my 40s, I keep it off as much as possible, and don't really engage with it. But this idea of neuroscience as having some kind of existential overlay, and that we connect in more with the existential givens, or we connect differently with the existential givens as our brain changes.
And how fascinating it is for both the I and the we, because sometimes that connecting in with death is foregrounded for an acute sense of being, but it also can change our sense of who's we if we're all going to die. The field gets to all of life. in those moments.
Yeah, and maybe that's why when you're dying, you see all your old relatives.
Yeah.
Because the
You all
we's
get to
just
be
got
part of
really
we.
big.
Yeah.
Yeah. This whole
Yeah.
new group of we people come in from the other side.
Even with their irritations and their stolen spoons.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Any other comments around things? Yeah.
I don't know. I want to go a little bit back to attention when you spoke about that. So I mean, it's just like really kind of simple, but what I'm sitting with is so people alter their attention by using pharmaceuticals. So what happens then in terms of, so is there really a difference between your 20s and now? Then you were smoking dope, now you're using something else, but still in the same space. And the other thing is I find people diffuse their attention. They continuously find looking for habits, practices to diffuse attention. So almost when you're in that situation, I ask myself, how am I useful to this person? Or actually, I think I can't actually help this person as a coach or in any way, unless we've dealt with those things. I don't know, what do you think about what I'm saying?
Again, I'm not sure if this is really getting to answer you exactly, but there's something, I suppose, about states and traits, that our state of paying attention can be influenced positively or negatively by substances. Caffeine brings our attention in, marijuana opens attention out. It can change what it is that we pay attention to. So not only the field of attention that expands or narrows, but also what it lands on. And then the patterns of this over time can change, I suppose. And what really interests me is what changes around what is marked by the brain as relevant enough to give this scarce resource of attention to, because I've mapped it. We give attention to things that map as important to survival of me or we. And so how is that structure changing or not changing, shrinking, expanding or shrinking over time? I mean, I think for some people it shrinks over time. And so what does attention land on, but what is the quality of the attention that lands, I think maybe is part of what you're asking.
Yeah, but even if you're working with somebody who's using an antidepressant and have been using it for a long time, there isn't really a capacity to hold attention. Attention creates too much anxiety. That's what I was referring to.
Yeah. So in the practices that are building attention or capacity in people who have psychotic states, they start with 30-second practices. So attention can be held, but you don't expose somebody to the trauma of very disruptive narrative for a long period. It starts with a 30-second practice, and then you step up to a minute, and then to 90 seconds, and that's that kind of attentional training.
All right.
Yeah. Cool. So, Julia.
Well, I'm just interested in Daniel's comment, because I mean, I don't know, in my own experience with antidepressants, and I really hate them because they make me feel all flum. But initially, I can also become more I'm less aware of my own states, but much more focused on other people's states. And I see other people's states much more clearly and as more disconnected from me, which is quite useful in trying to understand where I end and another person begins. I mean, I think it's worth talking about, because it's something that therapists talk about a lot. Like, can you treat people on drugs? It's like a really relevant thing. And then the other thing is, like, most of us are on some kind of drug. If it's not alcohol, it's work, or it's sleeplessness, or it's sex, or it's some other kind of drug. So, like, maybe, you know, where is the pure mind? I mean, I don't think I've had a pure mind space in my life for more than a week. Okay, maybe I'm an addict. But it's an interesting question. So maybe we kind of just have to work with what we've got. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's a great question. Yeah.
I mean, and it's such an interesting starting point.
I think what Julia said that was so profound for me is that there's still a capacity to hold attention. It's just for a short period.
Yeah.
So what can still in that short moment really be with someone? And that's sometimes enough. You know, how do we know what's enough for someone? You know, so that's actually very good news if you think of it that way. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's good. Good.
Thanks. Yeah, and I mean, it's such a, you know, consciousness and attention and awareness. You know, we only have access rarely to our own experience of it in that way. But it's so interesting to watch it, you know, and to watch the patterns of where attention lands, and watch the patterns of narrowness and broadness of focus, and to watch the patterns of how that shapes what comes next in our own experience, and then yeah, use that insula to understand what might be going on for the other person. I mean, it's so helpful, Julia, as you're saying, you know, to know that experience from the inside out. It does build the capacity for understanding it from another person's perspective so much more vividly. So I wanted to end just in kind of pulling it together, that what we've been talking about is the new connections between these midline cortical structures, helping us to become aware of the lenses that we see through, and what can allow that to be made, our subject to be made more object. This thickening of the insular cortex, either through the undercoat of the body scan practice, or through practices that, I mean, if we had more time, I would do like a befriending practice, which is one that has had a lot of research done on it, that has been shown to thicken the insular cortex. Maybe we do that another time. But those sorts of practices, those meta practices that actively engage and recruit more neurology into that insular cortex, and then expanding our salience network, you know, noticing that fuller human experience. It's not only warped by me, myself, and I, and what I want, but can take in more of the data that's available in the field of knowing to us. And I wonder what it might mean for you, and what it might mean for your clients. If there's anything in the session today that feels like it might be a nuggety thing you can hold in your hand and take away from the conversation.
For me, it's attention.
Yeah, Meg.
Yeah, for me, it's that thing of the destabilizing sense of moving from subject to object, and how often we're working with that with our clients. And so it's a reminder of to just flip and go gently, you know. Yeah.
And for you, Meg?
Maybe the same thing.
Yeah. Cool.
There's something for me, and I tried to articulate this in my group, and I didn't manage it, I don't think, and I'm still not sure really what I'm talking about, but it's something about like mind is no longer separate from the world. There's an interaction of mind with context, and I never like earlier in my life I never really got that at all. Mind was separate.
Yeah. The sense of inside and outside is.
Sorry, say again?
The sense of inside and outside is much more.
Yeah, or a constant exchange.
That's very cool, Simon. Yeah. Yeah. Any other closing thoughts, bits that you're taking away? Yeah, Anne.
What I'm finding really helpful is, and I think we see it, and it's what's happened today is to be able to understand a little bit better of what's actually happening is, and I think this is what appeals to us about coaching is this you know, the piece Meg's talking about, you know, the shitty stuff and how hard that is, but there's such a it's rewarding, I suppose, to work with people when you see that small world, that small world expand, and for them to begin living in a bigger, and ourselves to live in that more expanded world, and the pieces around complexity that start to play a part that we can work with. Yeah, and I mean, you've explained it to us. We see it and we've watched it and we work with it, but it's just great to be able to understand more of what's really going on.
Cool. Well, Julia, I want to hand back over to you, I think.
You know, this morning, I thought, let me have a look at a tarot card, and, you know, not wanting to be offensive to people who don't like those things. But what came up for me was the Four of Cups, and it was this person sitting on a hill, and they're looking at 3 cups that have fallen over, and that represent a kind of a end to something. And the gaze is so focused on the 3 cups that have fallen that they're missing this strange little other cup that's coming through the sky with a new offering on them. And it really, how you were talking, kind of landed that idea of, you know, what you pay attention to will build that part of you. And in the work that we do towards trying to have an honorable and positive relationship with ourselves, I think that there's a lot of what you said that I'm really going to take to heart about what I focus on in myself and the attention that I receive from myself towards myself. I found this a hugely stimulating session, so many ideas, and I absolutely love this work, and I hope that you will continue to develop this work, Nicola, Dr. Graham. It's really fantastic, the linking between these fields, and it's going to help us increase our white what's-a-what's that you mentioned. So thank you so very, very much for this spectacular event.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for sticking around to the end. And yeah, it's been really interesting, such an interesting conversation for me. So I can, Julia, on the back of that, can we finish with a poem? Is that okay?
Oh, please finish with a poem. We love poems.
So it's called Imperfection, just because of what you said. And it says, I'm falling in love with my imperfections, the way I never really get the sink clean, forget to check my oil, lose my car in parking lots, miss appointments I've written down and I'm just a little late. I'm learning to love the small bumps on my face, the big bump of my nose, my hairless scalp, my chip nail polish and toes that overlap. Learning to love the open-ended mystery of not knowing why. Failing at lists, using my time wisely and not reading the books I should. Probably I should hang my clothes neatly in the closet and all the shirts together and the pants and send Christmas cards, or better yet, a letter telling of my perfect family. Perfect was the laundry done and folded, all my papers graded, the whole truth and nothing but. Now the empty mind is what I seek, the formless shape, the strange off-center, sometimes fictional me. So yeah, thank you everyone for being part of this conversation. It's been very cool to be here this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola.
We look forward to having you back.
Yeah, fantastic.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Nicola.